I was born, raised, and still live in Texas. I come from a family of hunters. It's pretty much a family tradition. I'm going to tell you about something that I experienced when I was 20 years old, back in 2005. My father had just been diagnosed with lung cancer, and everyone in my family was naturally devastated by this, especially me, since my dad and I were very close. I had a lot of other personal stuff going on in my life at the time, and I felt that I needed to go out for a few days just to clear my head. I decided to make it a solo hunting trip, and packed up some camping gear, along with my Marlin 336 that my dad gifted to me when I was 18. If I could get sentimental for a moment, my father ended up passing away 3 years after his diagnosis, and to this day, I still use that rifle for hunting. Anyways, I'd say this happened around late October, early November. I don't want to be too specific with a location, because technically, I wasn't supposed to be hunting in this specific area. However, I will disclose that it was near the Mexican border. This will be important later. I decided to set up camp for 3 days before heading back. I had been hunting on this land before with some friends of mine, and I knew the precautions to take not to be spotted by the game warden. I'm sure if there's any other hunters listening to this broadcast, they'll be more than happy to tell you that we often wipe our asses with the rulebook. Before anyone judges me too harshly, or the practice of hunting in general, I will say that I'm a very spiritual person, and I have a profound respect for Mother Nature. I don't leave trash everywhere, and every animal that I put down, I never let go to waste. I'll be the first to admit, there are hunters that give us a bad name, and me not following the rules is more of a middle finger to the government than it is to the sport of hunting. I once straight up beat the shit out of someone who was a friend of a friend for shooting a stray dog for absolutely no reason. If it's consolation to anyone, I handed him a horrible ass-whooping for that. But I digress. The first day went off without a hitch, no problems whatsoever, aside from the fact that there was no game to be found anywhere. So I figured that I would head further south the next day to see if my luck would improve. Other hunters knew about this restricted location and may have already cleaned out this area. As night fell, I found myself sprawled out next to my truck, just staring up at the night sky, wondering if me and my dad would ever take another hunting trip together. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps slowly making their way through a nearby brush. This was alarming for obvious reasons. Whoever they were, they had the drop on me. I knew better than to light up a campfire under these circumstances, but if this person was roaming around in the dark without a flashlight, they may have had some kind of night vision apparatus, giving them the advantage. I was concerned, because if you were looking at me through the trees at that particular moment, it would have appeared that I was sleeping. I was in this odd position where I was resting on top of my sleeping bag with a blanket, because I felt claustrophobic being fully immersed in a sleeping bag. It was a good thing too, because this meant I was able to mobilize quickly, and something told me that I only had seconds to make a decision. I rolled sideways, and as soon as I did, I caught a quick glimpse of a muzzle flash coming from the tree line directly in front of me. I felt dirt fly up and hit my back from the bullet striking the ground next to me. I scrambled to my feet as more shots rang out from the trees, one of them shattering the passenger side window of my truck. I took cover behind the bed of my pickup and quickly drew the .38 snub-nose that I had strapped to my ankle. After the gunfire died down, I laid flat on the ground and returned to fire in the direction of the trees from under the truck. I heard several sets of footsteps fleeing from the area, but I held my position in case my theory about the night vision was correct. With only 2 rounds left in my .38, I pretty much spent the rest of that night underneath my truck with my pistol aimed at the darkness until the sun came out and illuminated my surroundings. I very cautiously got out from beneath my vehicle and packed up my gear as quickly as I could and hightailed it out of there. Later on, when I told a friend of mine about the incident, he said he wished I would have told him that I was heading that way. He would have warned me that the Mexican cartel started using that area to smuggle contraband and people across the nearby border. This friend of mine was a Mexican immigrant himself, and had several family members mixed up in the cartel and coyote groups, so needless to say, I trusted his word. All things considered, I think I got off pretty easy. Had I been in my sleeping bag that night, I have no doubt that bullet would have nailed me. These days, I stick to the designated hunting grounds. Some things are just not worth the risk.
A few years ago, I lived in my car. I was fresh out of college and overwhelmed with student debt. And being young, dumb, and 21, I thought car living was a good way to save money. I live in Southern California, so the rent is high and the weather is temperate enough to make this possible year-round. One night, I decided to park in a neighborhood I thought I knew well. It was right by the beach and a couple blocks next to an ex-boyfriend of mine, so I felt safe there, as I had walked the streets at night plenty of times. I parked, locked the doors, hung up the curtains so no one could look in, plugged in my earplugs so the cars passing wouldn't wake me, and fell asleep. Now my earplugs were effective, but crappy, and I could always count on them falling off in the middle of the night. I actually preferred this, because it meant I could fall asleep, but still hear my phone alarm in the morning. It was about 2 a.m. when I woke up to my earplugs already have fallen off, and something feeling wrong. Odd scratching noises were coming from the window. It started at the passenger side door, and then moved to the back seat doors. I froze, unsure of what to make of it, painfully aware that I leave my windows slightly cracked at night for ventilation. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I stayed frozen, trying to make sense of it all. That's when the flashlight turned on, and some man unmistakably was shining his light in, trying to find a crack in the curtains, and to my horror, he found one and shined it right where my face was. It's hard to explain, but the position of my head made it so I could piece together what was happening, based on the light everywhere, but he couldn't see my eyes. The scratching then continued, and I knew I was screwed. This went from potential attempted car theft to someone knowing I was in the car. I was literally paralyzed with fear and couldn't will myself to grab the baseball bat that I had. However, my last year of college, I took a class called Prad, which stood for Rape, Aggression, Defense, and remembered the number one rule: yell confidently and confrontationally at the man. I wish I could say I screamed something truly bad, but what left my lips was a loud, aggravated, and forceful, "Excuse me." It was super lame, but it echoed. To my immense relief, I hear the sounds of his footsteps running away at top speed. But I kid you not, the man was laughing as he ran, like it was some kind of game. I was still paralyzed, but eventually, him running gave me the courage to get up, grab my bat, and shove my way to the front seat, where I started the car and sped away. I didn't see him, and I spent the night at a friend's house. I live in an apartment now. It wasn't until the next morning I realized I had parked 1 block away from a bar, and, at the time of the incident, the bar had just closed.
When I was 11, almost 12, the woman living above me was a coke dealer. The night of my 12th birthday, she went missing. Not long after, her boyfriend came down to ask if he could use our phone. This was 2004, so having a cell phone was more of an exception than a rule, at least in my area. For a little context, I was home alone at the time while my mom was at work about a 5-minute walk away. My mom had let our neighbor and her boyfriend come in to use our phone several other times before, so I assumed nothing was wrong with it and let him in, bringing him into the living room, which is towards the front of our apartment, to use the phone in there. He picks up the receiver, dials a number, waits a few seconds, then hangs up the phone. He does this a couple of more times before the front door of the building opens. You can easily hear the front door open from where we are. It's a very heavy door. The walls are thin, and the way our building is set up, it's a small, old, single-family house converted into apartments. My and my mom's apartment was the only one on the first floor, and our upstairs neighbor's apartment was the only one above us. Irrelevant, but there was also a much smaller apartment below us. My neighbor's boyfriend looked at me, put his pointer finger to his lips like he was trying to shush me, and told me not to tell anyone he was there before speed-walking to my room at the other end of the apartment. I watched my bedroom door close right before there was a loud, hard, cop-like knock on the door. My jaw dropped as I opened the door to see a police officer. He asked if my neighbor's boyfriend was there, and being scared, I stammered out, "Yeah, he just went into my room." The officer asked if he could come in, which I agreed to, and as he was coming in, he asked if he could let his partner in the back door and lead them to my room. We walked together to the back of the apartment, and I let his partner in. The back door to the apartment was right next to my bedroom door, but we had to walk around the kitchen table to get there. There was just barely enough space between the two doors to fit a narrow rectangular table against it without blocking the path to either door. As I let them into my room, I watched as they pulled my neighbor's boyfriend out of my bedroom closet. As they brought him out of my room and towards the back door, which just led to an enclosed fire escape, they told me to go wait in the living room while they brought him out the back door. I walked back to the living room, and after they closed the door, I could hear what they were saying, and I could hear the distinct sound of metal clicking, and quickly realizing that he had been handcuffed. Still scared, I waited for the police car to drive away before grabbing my keys, making sure that the back door was locked, and locking the front door on my way out before running to my mom's work, crying. Pretty sure I cut the 5-minute trip into about 2 minutes, and I've never been a fast runner. I was fueled entirely on adrenaline and fear at that point, and I just wanted my mom. When I told her what had happened, my mom was so angry that he had used me the way he had, hiding out in a child's bedroom closet, of all places, to try to keep the cops from finding him. She gave me a short but gentle lecture that night about not letting people in to use the phone, telling me that I was not to let people use our phone, even if I knew them, unless she was home. I don't want to know what exactly he was wanted for, nor do I want to know what would happen if the cops had not shown up. I don't know if he had known that the cops were on their way and had come to my apartment specifically to hide from them, or if he was up to something else and knew it was the cops when the front door of the building was opened.
I work summers as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. So like a routine camping trip, we canoed out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counselor Mike take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, and play games, etc. We cook some food over the fire, sit around and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30-ish, I tell the kids it's time for bed, and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still in line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed, and me and Mike are talking by the water, smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out, before we decide to head into our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us slowly and slightly above water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we are responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we are camping with a group from a recognized organization, and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew nearer. Paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of gray hair that was trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized she was missing most of her teeth. "Are all your children safe in bed?" she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond, and quite frankly, terrified, I responded by telling her that they were fine and that she had to leave. "That's good. Just as expected for this time," she said with a smile, then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids that we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later, across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids the same age group. She sent me a text, which read something along the lines of, "Hey Sean, stop messing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know that I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie, and that I was not trying to play a joke on her. Apparently, one of her kids had opened their tent door to go to the bathroom and saw a woman with long gray hair standing a few feet away with her arms outstretched towards them. When I was 14, I was sent to a mental institution. Here's why. I don't have any friends, and I kept to myself. I loved to look at pictures of dead people, and to be honest, I still do. My parents struggled with trying to make me act normal, and I have no explanation for you or for them. I didn't like other kids. I didn't like anyone, not even my parents. The only person that I did like was my little brother Harold, who was just like me. He was quiet, and he didn't have any friends either. We would play outside and hang out all the time, and everything was great. Until this one night. Harold and I got into an argument, and he told me that he wished he could kill our parents. I wasn't close with our parents, and like I said before, I didn't even like them, but I never felt like hurting them. Harold told me that not only did he want to hurt them, he wanted to cut them open with the pocket knife in the garage. He wanted to take the knife and slit them open. This made me cry. I ran to my parents' room, probably like 2 o'clock in the morning, screaming and crying. Harold followed me and was screaming that I was lying over and over. I screamed and told my parents what Harold said and what he wanted to do. My mom started crying uncontrollably, and my dad started breathing really heavy. Obviously, what I told them was scaring them, and Harold was crying too at this point. The next day, my dad took me to the mental institution. For the longest time, I was in that hospital, angry, not understanding why I had to live there and Harold didn't. It wasn't until 7 years later that I learned why. My dad came to visit me one day, and when I asked about Harold, as I always did, he finally said it. Harold didn't exist. I ran into their room that night, screaming and arguing with myself about how I wanted to kill them. But I didn't want to. This was out of this world, insanely scary. Please forgive the short length. Not much happened. I was 11 years old, living in Boston with my dad. I woke up one night super late for an unknown reason. You know how sometimes you just wake up, look around your room, and then fall back asleep? Yep, that's what happened. I woke up not sure what time, but sometime in the middle of the night. I was looking around the room, and sitting in the darkness of my open closet, I saw a face. A face I had never seen before. Someone was sitting in my closet looking at me. The ability to move my limbs completely left me. I was frozen. I stared at this person for what felt like an hour. Trying to remember now, I'd say it was really only about 20 seconds. Whoever it was reached their arm out of the darkness in front of them and slid the closet door closed, looking into my eyes the entire time. The door closed, and I lay there frozen for probably another 20 seconds. And then I realized I had to leave this room. Obviously, there was no way I was going to go back to sleep. I got up as silently as I could and walked out of my bedroom, which the door was cracked open. I ran to my dad's room and went inside. I woke him up, and naturally he was shocked when I told him that someone was in my closet. He told me to stay in his room, and he went to check. The thought of something happening to my dad scared the hell out of me, so I was crying, waiting for him to come back. After a minute or two, he finally came back and told me that no one was there. Cliché ending, I know. I will say this, I do not care if people believe me or not. It really happened. I was not dreaming. When I left my room, whoever it was in the closet left as well. The front door, the back door, and most of our windows were all unlocked. Stupid, I know, but we were ignorant. This happened 6 years ago, and when I try to remember the face, I can't visualize the details, except one thing. One thing I have always been sure of. It was a man, and he was missing teeth. How do I know? Because he was smiling at me the whole time.
This incident occurred sometime in the fall of 2006. I grew up in a rural part of Ohio. My house had fairly dense woods located directly behind it. As a child, I had a passion for exploring. I especially loved exploring those woods. It was my favorite place to be. Prior to this incident, I had wandered through those woods many times, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree in particular that I frequently enjoyed to climb, usually about to the halfway mark, so I could perch myself on one of the heavier branches and just relax as I listened to the peaceful sounds of nature. Climbing that tree for the very first time was quite an accomplishment. From that position, I could partially see the back of my house. On that day, after a fair amount of exploring, I carefully scaled my favorite tree. I seated myself on a sturdy branch and took in the view. Naturally, being late in October, the sun inevitably began to set within a few minutes. I always felt a little saddened to see the darkness approaching. The woods were like my own little sanctuary. I could entertain myself out there for hours. When darkness began to fall, however, my mother would stand at the edge of the woods and call my name until I obediently returned home, so not to be stranded out there after dark. After watching the sun set until I could no longer see it, I began my descent down the tree. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard my mother's familiar voice calling my name. I thought nothing of it at first, as this routine had occurred plenty of times before. Then I realized something strange as my feet touched the ground. My mother's voice was coming from behind me, deeper in the woods, rather than towards the entrance where she always stood when she called me home. My mom had never entered those woods before, at least not with me. I was eager to find her and show her all of my favorite spots before it grew too dark. That's when I realized something was off. How could she have gone into those woods ahead of me? Certainly I could have missed her, but as I said, she never entered those woods. She continued calling my name, but there was something strange about it. She sounded absolutely frantic, almost angry. Fearing that I was in trouble for reasons currently unknown, I froze in place. As her voice drew closer, I squinted my eyes to see if I could locate her and determine exactly how angry or upset she appeared to be. However, I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. Suddenly I heard her voice calling my name from the direction of my house, sounding much calmer. Seconds later, from somewhere within the woods yet again, it wasn't an echo. I wasn't imagining things. I was literally hearing her beckoning me from the edge of our backyard, as well as ahead of me. My legs suddenly turned to jelly. I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. "Come here, right now," the voice that I originally believed to be hers screamed from just ahead. I realized that whoever or whatever was mimicking my mother was drawing closer. I didn't question which voice was actually my mother's, as there was something about the way it sounded that unnerved me. Terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer, I turned around and ran towards the exit of the woods as quickly as my legs could possibly carry me. It was amazing that I didn't trip over anything in my haste. Even though my house wasn't very far away from me from where I was standing, those woods had never seemed larger to me than they did in that moment. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name, now sounding desperate. Panic set in as my actual mother finally came into view, waiting patiently as she usually did until I returned home. In my frightened state, I absolutely refused to look back. As soon as I was out of the woods and in the backyard next to my mother, the other voice was suddenly gone. Rather than fading away, it seemed to stop the very moment I stepped foot into my backyard. I must have looked as frightened as I felt because my mother asked me what was wrong. Slowly but surely, my panic subsided. I didn't say anything until we were safely inside the house with our doors locked. I asked my mother if she had entered the woods. Appearing confused by the question, she told me that of course she didn't. With that confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she had heard anyone else calling my name and yelling. The answer to that question was also no. Although I was still very much shaken up, I managed to explain everything that happened as clearly and rationally as possible. My mother was surprisingly nonchalant about the whole situation, explaining that I must have imagined it, that I was spending too much time out there by myself. The incident in those woods had stayed with me to this day. I can still hear this voice as clear as a bell. Whoever or whatever is calling my name sounded exactly like my mother, but I know it wasn't her. Not only was she waiting for me outside, but the voice also sounded strange in a way that I still can't fully explain. I didn't go back into the woods until I was 17 years old, and even then, I never hung out for very long. I've carefully gone over every possible explanation, but none of them seemed entirely plausible. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way she could have pulled it off, not to mention the fact that she's never been one to play pranks. I also highly doubt that it was anyone else because, as I stated before, we lived in a very rural area. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have known my name and where to find me? We've since moved out of that house, but my mother and I occasionally discuss the incident. She still claims that she never heard or saw anything unusual out there. I know it probably shouldn't, but what happened in those woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that day and never had anything out of the ordinary occur. The best explanation I have at this point is a doppelganger or possibly a demon, but I'm unsure. If anyone has a possible explanation as to what might have happened, I'd love to hear it.
This happened when I was 23. I am a small female, and this story has changed my life. It was almost midnight when I got off of work at my job as a chef. The town that my restaurant was in always bustled with activity. The bars and diners were always packed. I climbed into my dented-up Ford Taurus and turned the key. Immediately I cursed myself for not getting gas on my way to work. There was no way I was going to make it home on less than a quarter of a tank. Irritated, I pulled out of my spot and onto the parkway, driving towards a popular chain gas station. When I pulled up to fill my tank, there was an eerie silence that hung over the gas station. I was the only customer there, which felt strange. I popped open my tank and started pumping fuel, annoyed that it was taking so long. Another car pulled up and parked at the pump right next to mine. It was an odd choice, since there were at least 8 unoccupied others to choose from. Turning away from the car, I finished fueling and closed the door to my tank. There was a cheesy song blaring over the speakers, so I didn't realize that a man had walked up behind me. I turned around and was startled. I then took a few steps back. The man smiled. He wasn't much older than me. "Can I help you?" I asked. He was standing in front of my driver's side door, blocking me from climbing inside. At first, he just looked at me and said, "Pretty thing like you shouldn't have to pump gas by herself. You should get your man to do that for you." My blood ran cold. He knew that I was alone. My car windows weren't tinted, so it was obvious that no one was with me. "Out here so late all on your own?" he went on, dragging his finger over my door handle. I tried to not let him see that I was terrified and kept his eye contact. "My husband is at home, and he's waiting for me to get back from work. It was nice to meet you. You have yourself a good night." I bluffed, taking a step closer to the man, indicating that I was ready to get back into my car. "Sure, honey." As soon as he took a step back, I lunged into my driver's seat, shutting the door and locking it behind me. The doors to the man's car opened, and 4 other men climbed out, and my entire body started to go into shock. I realized that they may try to kidnap me. The first man pounded on the hood of my car as his friends started trying all of my door handles. Fear came over me as I grabbed my phone to call the police. However, all I saw was a connect charger message flash on my screen as the phone shut down. "Oh no! Oh my God, no!" I screamed. "Just leave. Just whip out of here and lose them," I thought to myself. I turned my engine over, and that's when the men surrounded my car, trying to use their bodies to block me from driving away. "Bitch, get out of your car," one of them screamed before punching my window. "We're not gonna hurt you." Like I would believe that. I took a deep breath and put my car in drive. I didn't want to have to run over someone with my car, but if I absolutely had to, I would. I inched forward, and the men tried to call my bluff by not moving. "Looks like this is going to be a game of chicken," I said to myself. I then moved my car forward even more, until they all scattered and climbed into their car. I took the opportunity and screeched out onto the parkway, almost getting T-boned in the process. I didn't know what to do. They had pulled up behind me and were now following me. If I drove home, they would know where I lived, and I had no idea where the police station was. I had a tank full of gas, so I decided that I would just drive until I lost them. I was too afraid to pull over at a business and try and seek help, and I couldn't outrun their car. So I did something that my dad would have yelled at me for. I decided to drive towards the woods, out to my grandmother's place. She lived in the middle of nowhere, and I knew of a few back roads I could take to try and shake them. So the chase began, them trying to run me off the road and tailgating me so close that I swear I heard our bumpers touching. Blood was rushing through me so fast that I was afraid that my eyes would actually burst out of my head. We made it to the windy road that led to my grandma's. If you aren't familiar with this road, it can be lethal, and that's what I was counting on. Them not knowing every twist and turn by heart like I did should slow them down. The speed limit was 35, and drops down to 20 when you're going around turns. There wasn't a single chevron in sight to guide these stalkers around the turns. I pushed the gas and brought my car up to 65, which was the maximum speed you could go driving down this road. I took each of the sharp turns furiously, constantly keeping an eye on my rearview mirror. I was gaining quite a bit of ground on them, and noticed that at numerous times they almost went off-road. I wasn't even using my brakes, for fear that the lights would warn them of each turn. I was afraid that I would actually die in a wreck, but anything was better than what these men had in store for me. I finally came to the one-lane bridge, cutting off a car coming from the opposite direction. This forced my pursuers to stop, as the other car came between us, making its way down the bridge. This was it. It was my opportunity to completely get rid of them. I drove down a long gravel driveway and killed my lights, pulling my car beside a parked pickup truck. I held my breath as I waited. A moment later, the car that was following me sped by. I counted to 10 and pulled up to the mouth of the driveway, watching their taillights vanish around a turn. I punched it and sped back the way I came from. I almost wrecked at one point for not keeping my eyes on the road. Finally, I lost them. I made it home around 2 in the morning. I pulled my car into the garage and locked all of my doors. Remember to always have your phone charger in your car. You never know when you may need to call the police.
It was my 11th birthday on March 2nd, 2012. I was a big fan of Selena Gomez, and I wanted one of her CDs for the radio my grandpa had bought me a few months prior. Anyways, my grandpa took my sister and I to Target after he got out of work to buy me a Selena Gomez CD I've been begging for. At this time, Target in my area had a small food court with a snack bar with Pizza Hut in it, which I always got when I went shopping there. My grandpa and sister and I, we all order our miniature pizzas, the personal pans. Then we sat down at the table with our food, which happened to be right by the register. After the worker gave us our pizzas, they headed to the back to clean up, I assume. So it was just my grandpa, my sister, and I in the food court. Everything was good for about 5 to 10 minutes while we were eating. But then I noticed my grandpa, who was sitting across from my sister and I, look behind me. He moved his eyes side to side as if he was watching somebody. I, with my heart racing because I was so confused, turned around, and that's when I seen the most disgusting and creepy looking man I've ever seen in my life. He was tall, maybe about 6'2" to 6'4". He was partially bald, had dirty stained clothes, and he smelled like pee. He was right behind me, going back and forth, eyeing my grandpa. And that's when my grandpa started to yell at the guy, telling him to get away. My grandpa then stood up and said, "If you don't get away from my granddaughters, I'm going to make you get away." And that's when the guy backed up and he just stared. My sister and I then got up and we quickly rushed over to the other side of the table where my grandpa was. We started to walk away, and that's when I heard the guy say, "You're very beautiful. Where are you from? You must be from the islands like Fiji or something like that." I turned around and he was looking straight at me. Then he pointed and said, "Yeah, you pretty girl." That's when my eyes got wide, and my grandpa rushed my sister and I down the aisle to get away from this guy. He was following right behind us, saying his name, along with his address, telling me that I could come visit him sometime. My grandpa kept a hold of my sister and I, making us go down different aisles to lose him. When we finally did, we quickly purchased the CD and went out to the car. When we got into the car, my grandpa was driving out of the parking lot, and we saw the guy walk out of the store looking around like he was looking for us, or specifically looking for me. He didn't see us, as we were already driving away. But I was completely terrified because that was something I've never experienced in my life before. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but I seen that guy one more time after that. 2 years later, when I was 13, again, I was with my grandpa, but it was just him and I. We were leaving my grandparents' house, and we got into the car to head to the mall. As we were at the end of our street, we seen the guy again, walking down the street. I stared at him wide-eyed, and we made eye contact, which made my heart drop in fear. He then immediately started to scream as soon as he saw me, and tried to run after the car as my grandpa drove off, but of course he didn't catch us. Later on, when we got back to my grandparents' house, I had found out there was an insane asylum right down the street from my grandparents' house at the time, which is where we believed he lived, since the address he gave matched the address to the place. I'm 19 now, and I never saw that guy after the last time when I was 13, and I'm really glad I didn't because he was seriously ill.
When I was 12, I remember one Friday night, and there's no way that I could ever forget it. My older brother and I were picking up snacks and drinks at a little convenience store for a party that we were holding that night. My brother had me wait in the car while he ran inside to get the chips and whatnot. This happened in the 90s, so cell phones were not really a thing yet, especially for a 12-year-old. I remember abruptly looking up and seeing a man's face peering into the window inches from mine. He had glasses on and looked intelligent, but creepy. He smiled, and it was obvious right then that there was something very off about him. I could tell instantly that his intentions were not good. He said hello, and then asked my name. I gave him a false name, and then he said that his name was John. I gave a nervous and forced smile, and it became increasingly awkward. I looked past the man, hoping to see my brother walking over to the car, but I was filled with disappointment. He was still inside the store. The man, or John, as he said his name was, then asked me if I lived nearby. This was such a red flag that I was almost speechless and just replied, "Not really." He kept a very creepy smile the entire time. I looked over his shoulder again and thankfully saw my brother walking towards the car. Just then, John tried opening the door. Thank the Lord it was locked. I don't remember locking it, but you can bet your ass that I was glad that it somehow was locked. I didn't have time to react, and John immediately walked away after the door didn't budge. My brother walked up seconds later and asked who the hell that was. I was shaking and told him that I had no idea. Nothing else happened that night, and the party was great, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but think that this guy was trying to kidnap me. However, about 2 years later, I saw the guy on the news. He was captured and sentenced to death for murdering 3 teenage boys. Sound unbelievable? Trust me, I have trouble believing it myself. 30 years. I'm from Belfast, Ireland. I have a large friend group, and we would always have sleepovers at my house. This is the story of how one campout in my back garden went wrong. I live in a nice neighborhood, mostly with old people in it. It was around Easter, and in my school, we get a week and a half off for Easter break. Just before school ended, we decided to have a campout in my back garden because I recently got a new tent that could fit probably my whole friend group into it. It was the Saturday after we finished, and we all met up at my house around 7 o'clock. We ordered pizza, made marshmallows around the fire, and all in all, we had fun. At around 12:30 a.m., we all decided to crawl into the tent and play some card games, as it was getting quite cold outside. I dealt all 13 decks, and we began a game of Jack Change It. After around 5 different card games, we all ordered some food and climbed into bed to wait for the food to arrive. We got a text message saying that it would be there in around 40 minutes, so we all could relax for a while. The food came, and we all went outside to sit around the fire and eat it. I have a large back garden, and we were at the bottom of it, so we weren't afraid of waking my parents up by singing and talking loudly. After finishing our food, we got back into the tent and decided to get some rest. When everyone had drifted off to sleep, I was awoken by a strange sound. A sort of whistling sound. I brushed it off as being me dreaming, but around 2 minutes later, there it was again. Every 2 minutes it happened. I woke up my friend and told her to listen. Right after I said that, there was a different kind of whistle, and it came from the other side of the tent. This was when we decided to wake everyone else up. After around 10 minutes of listening to the whistling going back and forth, we heard footsteps coming from behind the tent. The crunching of leaves made us all fall still. We counted to 3 and broke out of the tent sprinting. All of us ran as fast as we could to the back door. Once we were all in, we locked it and looked out the window. We could just barely make out 3 people standing in the garden, looking up at us.
I'm a female in her 30s. I was born and raised in Gainesville, Florida. About a decade ago, while I was still in college, I would often take babysitting jobs to make extra money. I usually would watch Mrs. Gruder's 2 young boys named Ashton and Samuel. They were twins and were very well behaved. It was always a pleasure spending the night with them. This was around late October on a Friday. Right after my class let out, I went straight over to Mrs. Gruder's place. She and her husband planned on going out of town for a few days, and I was to watch over the twins until their aunt came over on the following day. This worked out well for me, because the boys and I would usually watch TV in the living room until around 8:30, which was when I was to put them to bed. I planned on spending the rest of the night studying for the upcoming mid-semester exam. After I put the boys to bed, I was working on my laptop in the living room, when suddenly, that eerie feeling of being watched came over me. I tried to shake off this feeling, but I became increasingly uncomfortable. It got so bad that I had to get up and look out the back patio door. When I looked out, the only thing I saw was an empty backyard. But something did catch my eye. Towards the fence that separated their yard from the neighbors was one of those old metal swing sets. I remember Mrs. Gruder mentioning at some point that it was left over from the previous owners of the house. There were only 2 swings on the set, and one of them was rocking back and forth, the way it would if someone had just gotten up from it. When I turned back around, I was nearly startled to death to see that Sam was standing directly behind me. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. After stopping myself from going into cardiac arrest, I asked Sammy what he was doing out of bed. His response made my blood turn to ice. "The woman with no head is keeping me up. Can you please tell her to leave?" I was floored to hear him say that, especially after experiencing that uneasy feeling while I was studying. But my rationality took a hold of me, and I told him that he just had a bad dream. But he asked me to come with him back to his room and stay with him until he fell asleep again. Of course, I obliged him. I adored Sammy, and I would have done anything for him or his brother. When we got back into his bedroom, I was surprised to see that Ash was sitting up in bed. As soon as he saw us, he asked his brother, "Did you tell her about the woman that was in here?" Sam responded, "Yes, but she thinks I was having a bad dream. I didn't know that you saw her too." I was immediately put on edge. If Sammy was just having a nightmare, why did Ashton see the same thing? I tried my best to convince the boys that because they were twins, they shared a special connection, and when one of them would have a bad dream, the other could sometimes feel it too. I didn't believe my own words, but I didn't want to bring up the word ghost because I didn't know how their mother would react to me explaining to them what a ghost was. I decided to stay with the boys and read them a bedtime story until they fell back asleep. Once they were both snoring again, I made my way back into the living room. I immediately noticed that I never closed the blinds above the patio door. As I approached the door, a stranger stepped into view. It was a woman wearing an old-fashioned dress. She appeared to have no color to her. She looked like she came right off the screen of one of those old-timey black-and-white movies. She did not look like someone who was living in the 21st century. The woman stared daggers at me. I could feel the hatred behind her cold eyes. What happened next is something that I still try to convince myself didn't happen, but my memory is just too vivid for me to be making this up. The woman's head did a 360 and then simply fell off her body. I remember putting one hand over my mouth to stop myself from screaming. The headless apparition remained standing, even after its head fell off. I know that what I'm about to say will make no sense to anyone listening, but I could still feel the woman's cold stare, even though her head was now gone. The image of the headless woman faded from view, and I quickly closed the blinds and made my way back into the boys' bedroom. I slipped under the covers with Sammy and stared at the bedroom door until I eventually passed out. I told no one about what I saw. It wasn't until I got into my car after the boys' aunt came to relieve me that I had a complete nervous breakdown. I never told the Grooters what I experienced because I didn't want to risk them switching babysitters. I cared too much about Ash and Sammy to allow something like this to prevent me from ever seeing them again. I continued to babysit for the Grooters until the twins were old enough to look after themselves. The Grooter house was located in a pretty unremarkable neighborhood. It was about as normal as you could get. Paranormal activity was the last thing I ever expected to experience there. Gainesville has quite the history, so I'm pretty sure there are more than a few restless spirits wandering about. And although I never went through anything like that again, I would still sometimes see one of those old swings rocking back and forth in the dark.
So this happened about a year ago. I know it because it was around Valentine's Day and I'd spend the week leading up to it just dreading it. Stalking my ex on Instagram and generally just felt pretty terrible about myself. We'd split up a few months earlier and she kept the flat we'd lived in, seeing as she did most of the work finding it. Her friend moved in and I moved out. It was a simple but painful arrangement. I ended up finding a flat for myself way out, on pretty much the outskirts of the city. I don't know if you've ever been to London, but flat prices are stupidly high, and if you want anywhere that's more than just a bed and a toilet, you have to abandon any hope of living remotely central. So the Valentine's Day season came around, and one weekend I was feeling fairly sorry for myself, working my way through a bottle of Prosecco. I should have really been sharing when I made a decision. I changed the radius on all my dating apps to be as small as possible, and tried to see if I could get a Valentine's date lined up. Half the time you matched with someone, and they'd reveal that they were on the other side of London to you, and your attempt to organize a drink would fall through. "It's too far," or "I don't have time tonight, maybe next week," were phrases you'd hear all the time. So, I'm not the most attractive guy. I think I'm honest enough with myself to say that, and I have a pretty good gauge of when someone I've matched with seems too hot to be real. Usually my hunches confirm when they send me a message advertising some Russian dating site in the first minute. Anyway, I meet Becca, who seems lovely, and very much in my league, and who lives actually not too far from me. We agree to go for a drink at the Crown the day before Valentine's Day, so as not to have the awkward expectation of anything extra romantic, which is pretty much the local for anyone who lives near my overground stop, and I'm pretty excited to be honest. She seems pretty funny. Maybe not wife material, but we get along, and for a while the thought of my ex off on her own Valentine's Day seems a lot less unpleasant. So, date night comes, and I have my usual beer or two before for a bit of Dutch courage and head off to the Crown. I send her a message to let her know that I'm on the way, and she says cool, she's almost there. It's a little dark out, and there's a thin mist of rain, but I shrug it off. It is London, after all. The walk to the pub doesn't usually take too long. You have to navigate loads of little back streets that ends up slowing you down a whole bunch, and I spend a little extra time to avoid some alleyways, just because I've heard stories about people getting mugged around here. But I arrive to the Crown only a bit late, and send her a message apologizing as I get in. She replies pretty quickly. Instantly, almost. "Shoot," she says. "Didn't get a chance to message you. There's a bunch of guys in there for someone's birthday, and they're being really rowdy, making me a little uncomfortable. I've nipped over to a restaurant down the road to see if they might have space for us." I mean, she's not wrong. There are a bunch of guys in here being loud and obnoxious, and I guess if you were a small woman, it would make you pretty uncomfortable. Not only that, but a group are smoking outside and jeering, and I could see how you wouldn't want to hang around outside for long. She sends me the restaurant's name and tells me to hurry. They'll save a table for us if I'm quick. This is where I get a little concerned. We never agreed to dinner. Not only that, but when I put in Google Maps, the location gives me 2 routes. One is pretty quick, and the other adds an extra 10 minutes onto your walk time, easy. The only issue is the shorter route goes right through this old estate that's semi-abandoned. I say semi because, although I'm sure people live there, I'm not sure who, and half the buildings are boarded up. I take one look at it and decide that there's no way I'm going through there. There are barely any streetlights, if any, and I can barely make out much more than a few dark shapes. I decide to take the longer way around and apologize to her, but let her know that I'll be a little later. She replies instantly again and tells me that I need to come now and that I should just be as quick as possible. I don't like her tone and tell her there's no way I'm walking through the old estate at night. Now I'm beginning to feel really uncomfortable and am aware of how alone I am on this route. Whilst it passes by several houses and shops, there's no one actually on the street itself. There aren't many people out on the night before Valentine's Day, and, come to think of it, I've got no idea why the restaurant would be so full in the first place. I get that funny feeling in my stomach where you know something's wrong but can't quite put your finger on it. And for some reason, I walk in the middle of the road for the last stretch. I think maybe I felt a little safer there, or at least in my head I think I'd be able to see anyone who came towards me. Thankfully, no one did. I did manage to freak myself out a little, catching my reflection in shop fronts and car windows, and have to make a conscious effort to not look at them because I know I'll only freak myself out more. I'd have turned right around, but I realized that I was actually closer to the restaurant than the original pub, and at this point I just wanted to see another friendly human face. I sped up my walking slightly, made sure to text a couple of friends just to be safe. All this time I'm walking, she's messaging me telling me just to hurry up and that the shortcut's fine. She literally just took it. But as soon as I mention I'm almost at the restaurant, she stops replying. Just like that. One moment she's telling me to hurry, and the next, as soon as it's clear I'm not going to use the shortcut at all, she's gone. Well, they're gone, I suppose. No way of knowing who it was. I get inside, and like I suspected, the place is fairly empty. It's definitely not booked out, and when I ask if the waiter's seen any woman like Becca asking about a table, he shakes his head. Not tonight, he tells me. Only a couple of families and an older couple. I think about texting whoever was claiming to be Becca, but even opening the conversation gives me the creeps. The idea that there's a couple of days' worth of chatting there, of whomever was on the other end pretending for whatever reason to be a normal person, gives me the chills. It's strangely weirder to think of someone that creepy pretending to be normal in a weird way. I think about walking back using the road, but I realize, looking out the window of the restaurant, that whoever was pretending to be Becca knows my exact location. They'll know I arrived and found out they were lying. I think about the fact that they might be watching me from somewhere, my silhouette in the window, and I ask if I can have a table whilst I order an Uber home. Even during the ride home, I hate the idea of my face near the window, and I try to lean into the middle seat. I get the driver to drop me as close as possible to my house, and my heart races the whole walk home. I never told them my address exactly, but the idea that they know the area I live in is enough to make me start looking at flats on the other side of the city. I think, as soon as I can, I'm going to move. I'm a 23-year-old female, used to not believe in ghosts at all. I'm a psychology student and used to think that everything can be chalked up to someone's own anxieties and fears. That was until last year. This happened in Colorado Springs on Gold Camp Road. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, you know that this place is a hotspot for urban legends and creepy ghost stories. The road is located on the side of a mountain and has several large tunnels dug through the mountain that you have to drive through to get to the end of the road. It's mostly used to get to scenic routes that overlook the city and hiking trails. There are also all sorts of scary stories that I'm sure you've heard of if you grew up in the area. The story goes that a bus full of small children crashed within one of the tunnels after it partially collapsed, and the spirits of those children are trapped in the tunnel. Supposedly, if you drive in the tunnel at night and come to a stop, turn your lights out, and put baby powder or flour on your windshield, little ghost hands will smear the powder all around. Also, I'm not sure if this story has any validity to it, but I've been told a lot of people dump bodies over the side of the road. The cliffs and heavy wilderness apparently make it a good place to hide evidence. Anyway, this was all nonsense to me. I would drive the Gold Camp Road about once a week during the summer, as it was a beautiful night drive to take with friends, and there are several pullover spots to smoke with relative certainty that you will not encounter any police. Now, I won't be offended if you think that the fact that I was a little out of it may have contributed to what I saw. Anything's possible. Anyway, my friend, a 21-year-old female, and I spent about an hour one night smoking, walking around the scenic spots, playing music until about 3 or 4 a.m. Again, we had been doing this exact routine all summer, and were used to the dark, creepy tunnels and the heavy woods at night. And this particular night was no different. That was until we started ascending to the peak. I'm not sure how to describe the feeling of getting to a certain point on the mountain, but it felt like a distinct passing over. There was a specific moment I remember feeling that we were in a completely different location. It was kind of like the moment in Spirited Away when all the spirits come out at night in the city in the beginning. It was like nothing was there and we were all alone, and suddenly it just felt extremely populated. We couldn't see anything and it was still dark, but it was like there was an energy all around us. It was like the sensation of being in a loud crowd without anything physical happening. I started to feel really uneasy, and my friend told me she was getting a little creeped out. I told her it was okay. We were almost to the second tunnel, and then we would descend. We entered the tunnel, and the headlights lit up everything to the end. That's when I saw it. A very distinct, clear-as-day little boy was just standing to the right of the tunnel, almost touching the wall. He didn't look exactly like a real boy that would be standing there. Instead, like an overexposed film photograph of a little boy. My friend and I both gasped, and I slammed the brakes dramatically. And then, just like that, it was gone. Now, I don't mean he disappeared. I mean we realized he was never there. You know that shock you get when you wake up in a dark room and you see a jacket hanging on the door, and for a split second are convinced someone is standing there, but as soon as your eyes adjust, you realize there was never anything there at all. It was like that, but there was nothing that we could have mistaken for any type of figure. The tunnel was lit up by headlights, and there was no rock formation or pattern in the wall or anything, just smooth rock wall and the bright light of my headlights. I have never seen anything like it. What convinced me is that my friend saw it too, and neither of us had the stereotypical reaction of mistaking something for a ghost, like just jumping or feeling a shiver. I slammed my brakes because I was positive there was a child, and then suddenly, there never was. It's the most bizarre experience I have ever had. I will never doubt the existence of the paranormal ever again. All I can say is, don't always discount urban legends. They have a funny way of reaching out to you.
This encounter happened to me while attending college at Auburn University in Alabama. It was the hectic part of the fall school semester when students are busy preparing for final exams. I was no exception to the rule. One of the nice things about Auburn University, which is not uncommon to many other colleges, is that the library remains open 24 hours a day during final exams. As you can imagine, such an open invitation draws in a large crowd. Students occupy all the available space on several floors with books and ideas. On this particular night, at least one of them was not a student. Let me explain. I arrived at the library early in the afternoon, navigated my way to the third floor, and quickly located a desk for intense concentration. Hours passed as I put my attention on the pages of my organic chemistry textbook. It became dark outside. I was extremely happy with my progress. I celebrated with a sandwich, chips, and a few beers. At just past 11 o'clock, Nature called. I entered the bathroom and made my way to the stall furthest from the entrance. A few minutes passed, and then another person entered. Here is where things turned creepy. We are two, and we are alone. For what seemed like an eternity, I only heard silence. No toilet flushing, no feet shuffling, no hand washing, absolutely nothing. Then, he locked the door. At this point, my mind was racing. Was I about to be robbed? Random act of violence? A joke? I tried to stay calm as he walked over to the stall that I occupied. Eventually, he broke the silence with an offer I will never forget. He offered me a Happy Meal. I kindly but firmly rejected, and thankfully, he exited the bathroom. I quickly finished my business, washed my hands, and left in a hurry. The exchange had me absolutely spooked. Study time was over. On my way out of the library, I spotted him. Our eyes locked briefly, and then I turned away. I could feel his stare. All that I remember about him is that he was a middle-aged man wearing makeup and a McDonald's uniform. I haven't eaten McDonald's since.
My name is Prad, and this story happened about 2 years ago. I recently started a new job and made a few casual friends quite quickly. One day at work, my friend George said he was having a house party on the weekend and invited me to come along. I accepted his invitation. That weekend, I drove to George's house party. I recognized a few faces, but most of the people that were there were his friends outside of work. I wasn't drinking alcohol that night as I was driving, and also I'm not much of a drinker anyway, so I was drinking soft drinks all night. At one point, a man approached me. He was wearing a scruffy leather coat, had a shaved head, bad teeth, and was quite small. He looked a lot older than most of the people at the party. He introduced himself as Jerry and said he was a friend of George's. We talked for a little bit, but the conversation was quite awkward for the most part. I finished my cup and said excuse me as I was going to get another refill. Jerry offered to get it for me, so I accepted his offer and gave me another drink. He came back and we carried on talking. However, it wasn't long until I started to feel sick and dizzy, and it was getting quite late, so I thought I would head home. I said goodnight to George and headed outside to my car. As I approached my car, Jerry called my name and jogged over to me. He asked if I could give him a lift home. I said sure, and Jerry got in the back seat. I found it weird that he sat in the back seat and not in the front, but I was more focused on going home. After driving for about 2 minutes, I started to feel worse, more dizzy and lightheaded. I heard Jerry unbuckle his seatbelt and unzipped his pants. I saw him in the mirror when he was leaning forward towards me. I was about to ask him what he was about to do, but I heard a police siren behind me, signaling for me to pull over. As soon as I stopped the car, I opened the door and threw up on the side of the road. A police officer approached me and told me he pulled me over because he suspected that I was driving under the influence. He also asked why my friend exited the vehicle and ran off. I asked the officer what he meant. He told me as soon as I stopped the car, the man in the back seat opened the door and ran off into the night. I was feeling like crap to think too much about it, but the officer wanted to give me a breathalyzer. I accepted it as I knew for a fact that I hadn't been drinking, and the results came back negative. The officer asked why I was driving that way, swaying back and forth. I told him I had just come from a party and I didn't feel well, so I wanted to head home. The officer looked at me for a moment, and then asked how well I knew the person that was in my car. I told him I didn't really know him. I just met him that night and was giving him a lift home. The officer then said he suspected that the man had spiked my drink. It was probably about to assault me. It made sense, and I told him that before I pulled over, he unbuckled his seatbelt and pants and was leaning forward. The officer said he will send out a patrol looking for the man who was in my car. He was very kind and trusted me when I told him that I felt fine and I can drive home, so he let me go. The next day, I told George what had happened to me and asked if he knew Jerry. George told me he didn't know anyone named Jerry, but he said he would ask around if anyone knew Jerry or recognized my description of him. Unsurprisingly, no one knew him. I often think how lucky I am that the police officer was there and caused Jerry to flee from my car, proving that Jerry had malicious intentions. Otherwise, who knows what might have happened to me that night. Be careful who you pick up. Be careful when you drive around at night. I'm 25 now, but this story happened when I was 16. I was camping with my dad and my twin sister at Cross Lake, Alberta. We will call my sister Mary and me Tilly. Mary and I are not identical. She is taller, blonde, has dark blue eyes, and tan skin. I'm shorter with icy green eyes, fit, and not as tan. It was midnight when Mary and I went looking for an outhouse to use before going to bed. We were walking down a path with a lantern when we saw another light heading toward us. We walked past a guy that looked to be in his late 20s, giving us a smirk. We chuckled as we continued down the path when Mary decided to look one more time. When she looked back, she saw him still standing there with the same smirk on his face, but this time it was more sinister. She froze in her steps, pulling my arm to get me to stop with her. The stare down between us three was so intense that I just wanted to go back to our campsite just so I could pee in the trees. What happened next made my heart stop. The strange man slowly started walking toward us. He then turned off his lantern so we couldn't see him. This made Mary and I run as fast as we could. We can hear the man's footsteps getting closer as he was letting out crazy laughs. The path we were on split off in two different directions. Mary turned right with the lantern and I turned left with nothing but fear. The path ended up taking me near the beach of the lake. I kept running until I can see an outdoor change room, where I ended up hiding. It didn't have doors, but I could see through the holes through the wooden walls by using the light from the moon. I sat there in silence for what felt like forever, and was convinced that he must have stopped chasing me a while ago. I took one more glance through the hole in the wall, when I heard the man's voice behind me say, "Don't be scared of me, Tilly. I just want to keep your eyes." I screamed and ran out of that room, but he caught me and threw me onto the floor. I was doing my best to fight him off. I was kicking, scratching, and crying, when unexpectedly I had dirt in my mouth. The man was trying to muffle my cries by shoving dirt in my mouth. He was then suddenly tackled off of me and began to gasp for air while being choked. I didn't know who was fighting off my attacker, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I ran out of the change room and seen a few flashlights heading in my direction. I came to a halt when I saw Mary running out of the group towards me. Mary and I kept our distance while we seen the mob of people screaming, attempting to peel off the hero from my attacker. Through all the moving lights, I managed to see my hero, and it ended up being my father. I can't tell you the rage my dad had on his face. His determination to kill my attacker was so strong, a small group of people struggled to stop them from fighting. Finally, the camp security came and detained my attacker until the police arrived. 3 days later, my dad sits me down and tells me the information he got from the officers. It turns out my attacker confessed to stalking me for 2 months, and he wouldn't stop talking about my eyes. He has been known to stalk teen girls, and there has been some reports of him being a peeping Tom. I've never seen or heard anything else about this.
This story happened to my brother, and is told from his perspective. On Halloween of 2017, I went trick-or-treating with my friends who all called Harvey, Michael, and Daniel. We were all around 14 to 15 years old, and really just wanted to make the most of Halloween, as we had so much homework starting the 10th grade, and we probably would never be able to trick-or-treat again. Anyway, we were all walking down this random street at like 9:30, when we saw one house with insane over-the-top Halloween decorations that looked like it cost up to about $500. The four of us walked up to the house and rang the bell. Some 50-year-old looking man opened the door and said, "No need to yell. Just come on in and you'll get your sweets." Daniel told the guy, asked the guy, "Can you just bring the candy out here?" The guy didn't even answer. And so the four of us just walked away, not saying a single word. But of course, this story wouldn't be scary if it didn't end here. We were walking down my street when Harvey pointed out, "Guys, that man is following us." We all looked out behind us and saw the same 50-year-old looking man walking about 25 feet behind us. The four of us bolted all the way to the house. We ran to my house, we thrust open the front door, entered my house, and locked the door. The four of us were just hyperventilating, as if we just ran an ultra marathon. I was starting to settle down when Jason said, "Look at the window." We all looked, and there he was, the old man looking through one of my windows. My parents were on a vacation, and my brother was at his friend's Halloween party, so we couldn't tell them. But what really made this horrifying was that I could see this guy holding a gun in his hand. I yelled at my friends, and we ran upstairs to call the police. The officers arrived in about 10 minutes. The man wasn't on my property anymore, but we remembered the house, so that's where we went. The cops went there, searched the whole place, and came out with the man in chains. It turned out the house was vacant, and the man was a serial killer who escaped from prison a month ago. If my friends and I are able to go trick-or-treating again, we're avoiding the street that this house was on. And who knows what that guy was really going to do if we went in. I'm glad this happened when we were teenagers and not when we were 9 years old. All I can say is if you're trick-or-treating, make sure that the house owner is completely normal.
Growing up in a working-class Latino family, we didn't have the luxury of taking lavish vacations throughout the year. However, that didn't stop us from exploring the natural wonders of Southern California through camping. At a young age, my sister and I understood the value of camping through our shared respect for Mother Nature. Over time, we mastered surviving in the outdoors, so much so that we desired to explore new campgrounds throughout the state. On one such occasion, a coworker of my father overheard him talking about his summer vacation plans and suggested to him a new campground to check out. To this day, my parents nor I are unable to remember the name of the campsite, yet we all agree that it was somewhere in the hills of San Diego County. My father was excited for the prospect of visiting a new national park and packed up the car for the customary family summer retreat. The drive up to the campsite was long and dangerous. Even though we were driving during the day, the steepness of the mountain, coupled with the numerous blind turns, had everyone sitting on the edge of their seats. Arguments soon erupted amongst us, as we didn't find any signs indicating where to go. This was in the age before smartphones and GPS. Eventually, we convinced our father to stop and ask for directions. As the campground came into view, we all let out a collective sigh of relief. We made it. And yet, the place did not look like it was a national park at all. There wasn't a ranger station or a welcome center anywhere in sight. The lake appeared murky like a bog, whereas the campground itself was devoid of life. A proverbial ghost town, with the only inhabitants being us. With our bewilderment aside, we cautiously surveyed the area, finding any clues that will guide us to the keeper of this place. Out in the distance, we saw a crumbling, open sign dangling in the window of a dilapidated diner. Just as the sign implied, we entered the establishment to inquire about the place. Pushing the creaking door open, we were greeted by the owner of the diner, a gaunt-looking man who I would now say was plucked straight out of the movie The Hills Have Eyes. "Well, how can I help y'all folks on this fine day?" My dad replied. "We made reservations to camp here, but I'm not sure if this is the right place." We then handed the man our booking papers for him to inspect. With his bony fingers grasping the pages, he replied, Yeah, you have the right place. I'm the groundskeeper of this here national park. Let me finish some paperwork on my end, and I'll get things ready for you and your family to stay here with us." As he wobbled off to the back of the diner, my sister and I retreated to the safety of our car. Although we were children at the time, we both felt a sense of unease, even dread at the thought of spending the night here. Despite our worries, our parents reassured us that the vacation had only just begun, albeit with a few bumps along the way. As we neared the site, all of our concerns were tossed out the window, as it was time to transform this empty lot into our secure encampment. The rest of the day came and went, as our campsite was beginning to take shape. The sounds of our radio, along with the rhythmic banging of the hammer, were the only echoes greeting us as the sun began to set. This detail stood out to me, due to the fact it was early July here in Southern California, and there are always people camping around this time. In either case, we all just brushed it aside and thought that more people would arrive by tomorrow. And they did. On the following day of the trip, my father went fishing at the lake. While he was off on his own adventure, my sister and I decided that it was time to have one of our own. Recruiting the aid of our mother, we set out to explore the campgrounds. To our surprise and elation, we discovered that this campground had its own public swimming pool. With our minds made up, the three of us got into our bathing suits, slathered on the sunscreen, and made our way to the pool. Soon my sister and I were splashing around in the water without a care in the world, until I noticed 3 suspicious men, dressed entirely in black. They came and sat at one of the chairs at the opposite end of the pool from where our mother was watching us. At first, I thought the men were new campers that had recently arrived at the grounds to examine the swimming pool, but to my dismay, the men just huddled around each other and whispered incomprehensible things while staring intently at the two of us. My mother's instincts caught on to the predatory behavior, and she decided to cut our excursion to the swimming pool short. When my father arrived from the lake, he said he was unable to catch any fish, and that the fish he did find were all belly up dead in the water. My mother then informed my father of the 3 suspicious-looking men eyeing my sister and I at the pool. This infuriated him. My father, brandishing his machete, stormed out in search of the group of men, ostensibly to talk some sense into them. Some time passed, and my father arrived back at the campsite, dismayed that he did not find the men, only a mother and her 2 little boys. This point may sound insignificant at first, but it will become important later in the story. As night fell, my sister and I were preparing to go to sleep, when we were suddenly jolted awake by the pleading screams of a woman. Her pleas were joined by the cries of 2 young children, and various male voices demanding their silence. My father recognized the woman's voice as the mother he saw earlier in the day camping alone with her 2 kids. My father, who is a former Marine, loaded his rifle and concealed his hunting knife. He then proceeded to tell my mother to take care of us, while handing her a loaded gun. I then saw my father head out towards the campsite, where the single mother and her children were staying. My sister and I were petrified when we noticed the terror-stricken look on our mother's face. As the yelling escalated, 2 thunderous bangs from the rifle rang out, which put an end to the chaos. Seconds later, we heard the crackling branches closing in, as someone moved quickly towards us. My mother, with eyes wide and knuckles clenched, aimed into the darkness, ready to protect us at all costs. To our relief, my father emerged from the shadows with a fearful mother and her 2 sobbing children. My father then claimed that he scared off the men who were harassing us at the pool, and will be helping the mother pack her things to leave. To ensure that they made their way down the mountain safely, my father offered to follow her in our car until she got to the main highway. In a moment of reprieve, the woman held her children tight. We all assured her that their safety was of the utmost importance, and knowing my father, any form of aggression needs to be handled quickly. With pleasantries aside, my father departed yet again to help the mother pack up her campsite and leave this backwater excuse for a national park. The few rays of sunlight that streamed into our tent signaled the start of a new day, since our father had left to escort the small family from the imminent danger. With a look of apprehension on my mother's face, my sister and I started to pack up camp, knowing all too well that we did not want to risk our lives spending another night at this place. I was making my way to the bathrooms when my eye caught the glimpse of our car slowly making its way back to camp. I ran back to tell my mother and sister, who noticed the car as well, and soon the bloodshot eyes of my father behind the wheel came into view. As he exited the car, he informed us that the mother and her children made it safely to the highway. This was then followed by a long pause, with my father saying, "Now let's get the hell out of here ourselves." With that, we all took our positions and packed up the rest of our camping gear. Before leaving this godforsaken place, my father informed the owner of the diner about what happened last night and about the 3 suspicious-looking men. The only thing that the emaciated-looking man said was, "Well, it's a damn shame that you and your family can't stay here a little longer." We then hightailed it out of there like bats out of hell, vowing never to return. Ever since this harrowing experience, my family and I have been unable to get my sister to go camping again. As time went on, I decided to ask my father where he had heard about that awful place, to which he added a new detail not previously disclosed. He mentioned that upon returning to work, he wanted to confront his coworker about the horrible camping recommendation he gave. When he tried to locate him, another coworker stated that the same man quit a couple of days before my father was going to return from vacation. My father was left speechless and confused upon hearing this. Was the man somehow connected to those 3 men? If so, what were their motives for harassing a family out in the middle of nowhere? The answers to these questions we will never know, but what I do know is this. If my father did not intervene on that fateful night, that single mother and her kids would have met a fate far worse than a failed camping trip. I'm not much of a storyteller, so bear with me. During the 90s, I went through a very rough time in my life. After a failed marriage, I became a bit of a nomad, wandering across country on foot with no particular destination. It was a stupid idea, but I was in a very hopeless place back then, and just looking to experience something new. I'd been traveling down South Dakota and hitched a ride with a truck driver into Nebraska. For those of you who have never been to that state, there are large sections of land that go on for miles with nothing but cornfields lining either side of the road. We split ways at a rest stop, and I made my way into what I now know to be the Sand Hills of Nebraska. The Sand Hills region is one of the most isolated areas in the United States, 20,000 square miles of nothing but dunes and prairies. I planned on hitchhiking my way to the nearest town and catching a bus to visit a friend I had in Omaha. Full disclosure, I had absolutely no idea what the hell I was doing. I subscribed to the "I'll figure it out when I get there" mentality. At the time, I didn't know a whole lot about Nebraska, but I found out the hard way that this stretch of road was not ideal for hitchhiking. I barely saw any cars going down this road, and the ones that did completely ignored me. 12 hours had passed, and I was running low on food and water. I was utterly exhausted at this point, and I needed to find a place to rest for a while. I had about an hour left of daylight. Lucky for me, I happened to come upon an old farmhouse that was situated about a half-mile away from the main road. From a distance, I thought this place may have been occupied, but when I got closer, it was clear to me that this house was abandoned. This was around the fall, so weather in Nebraska wasn't terrible. However, the nights were a bit on the cold side, so I decided to hold up in this house for the night and continue my journey the next day. I had enough supplies to last me one more night. The house was your typical rotting husk. Smelled like mold, severe water damage, creaking floors, etc. The living room seemed to be the only decent place to settle down at, so I unpacked my sleeping bag and eventually dozed off. I woke up to the sound of floorboards creaking. I immediately sat up and listened. I could hear several pairs of footsteps thudding all around the house. They were coming from upstairs, downstairs, on the back porch outside, and even in the same room with me. but I didn't see a thing. I quickly got to my feet and walked over to the nearest window and peered out. What I saw was truly alarming and sent a wave of nausea through my entire body. Several cloaked figures were standing side by side. They appeared to be encircling the house. Because of the footsteps I heard, I thought there may have been people in the house with me. So in an effort to defuse things, I made another big-brain decision and spoke up. Hello? I'm sorry if I'm trespassing. I was just looking for a place to rest for the night. I thought this place was abandoned. Again, I'm sorry. All the footsteps stopped at once. An eerie silence followed. It was so quiet that I could have heard a mouse shitting in the corner. I got this real bad feeling in my gut, so I reached into my backpack and pulled out my hunting knife. I gathered the rest of my things and slowly moved out into the hallway. Aside from the mysterious figures outside, I was also thinking of what was making those footsteps inside the house. As I said, I heard several footsteps when I woke up, so I figured it wouldn't be long before I ran into someone inside the house. But after combing the entire downstairs, I didn't see or hear anything. I could tell something was very off. That bad feeling I mentioned earlier intensified, despite the fact that I knew there was a bunch of weirdos in cloaks waiting for me outside. Something told me that if I didn't leave the house that very moment, something terrible was going to happen to me. The house was located in a wide-open clearing. Beyond the clearing was a barrier of tall grass. When I left through the front door, I stopped directly in front of the house. No matter which direction I looked, I saw another hooded menace blocking my way. I suddenly felt this heat on my back. I quickly turned around and was shocked to see that the house I just left was now engulfed in flames. I cannot explain how this happened. Moments before, I was inside that house, walking around, and it was now on fire. I backed away. I decided that I was going to run through the figures and get the hell out of Dodge, but when I turned back around, the figures were nowhere in sight. Things were getting way too bizarre for me at that point. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to get the fuck out of that place. When I got back out to the main road, I didn't stop walking until I finally got to a town, whose name I can't remember. The rest of my time in Nebraska went well, and I got my life together shortly after I got back home from my trip. As long as I live, I'll never forget that old farmhouse and those mysterious cloaked figures. This incident still baffles me to this day, but perhaps some things are best left unanswered.
This story didn't actually happen to me, rather to a close friend of mine. He told me the story a few hours ago and I wanted to share. He lives in Hayward and was attending a march for the BLM movement at around 4 p.m., I think. I don't know which streets or anything specific like that. He had just sent me a couple of videos of the crowd marching and taking a knee. So, after about 10 minutes, he said that they were passing through a street lined with shops and alleyways. There was an older man sitting on a curb by one alleyway watching the march. Jordan describes the man as looking upper 40s, wearing a black and white flannel shirt and jeans and a cap. Jordan had the misfortune of walking nearby said alleyway, and the man stopped him, saying something along the lines of what he needed help fixing his passenger seat since the recliner handle was broken, and it was a two-person job to get it back into its upright position. The man gestured towards his car, which Jordan examined. It was a black Chevy Malibu that was parked in possibly the most sketchiest part of the alley, right towards the back, kind of hidden behind a trash dumpster. Jordan declined and quickly walked away before the man could say anything else. Now, for his sake, I wish the story ended here, but I wouldn't be posting it here if it did. I think sometime later, like an hour maybe, Jordan decided to start heading home while the march continued. He says he was cutting across some field that was in between houses where only 2 other people were in sight, and as soon as he emerged at the other side, his air was suddenly cut off as a thick arm wrapped around his throat and began aggressively yanking him backwards. Of course, Jordan yelled as loud as he could, and thankfully the aforementioned two guys began to rush to his aid, shouting at Jordan's attacker. The guy let go and pushed Jordan. As Jordan stumbled forwards, he spun around and saw the guy who had asked him for help with his car, hopping into the Chevy Malibu and speeding off. The two other people asked Jordan if he was okay and comforted him and whatnot. Keep in mind that Jordan only told me this over a few texts, and I haven't gotten a chance to talk to him in public about it, so some details were spared. I think Jordan contemplated calling the police but didn't think it was worth it. He told me that they were probably already busy enough and he might be ignored or have an extremely long response time, to which the only info he had was a description of the guy. He hadn't gotten the guy's license plate. Jordan went home, and that's pretty much all he told me so far. It might sound cliché, but please, everyone stay safe. These are terrible times, and with all the looting and protests, stuff like this is bound to happen in the shadows.
I am an immigrant from Belarus. English is not my first language, so I apologize if I phrase things differently. Here's some backstory. I was only 11 when my family left the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. My father was involved with the Communist Party and would frequently visit Moscow when I was a boy. I don't know all the details. I don't even know what exactly my father's role was in the USSR, but from what I understand, we were granted asylum in the United States and had to flee Belarus in 1991. But that's not really why I'm writing this story. This is about something I saw in my childhood that has scarred me for life. This took place roughly a year before we left, so I'm guessing the year was 1990. My family, like many others, lived in a massive apartment building in Minsk. There were two other identical apartment buildings adjacent to ours, and directly behind the buildings was a playground area where I would play with my friends Sasha and Victor. Beyond the playground was a section of trees that separated a shopping plaza from the apartment grounds. I remember that my mother was feeling ill and was bedridden, and my father was away on business in Moscow, so I was pretty much on my own that night. I remember that I had gotten bored watching TV in the living room and decided to go outside and see if any of my friends were at the playground. I would say this was around 8 p.m., and it was dark out. By then, most of the children were inside, and I don't even think anyone was allowed on the playground at that time, but I didn't care. There was no one around to tell me to go back inside, and I was pretty excited to have the playground all to myself. It was chilly out that night, but it was not snowing, so I figured that I would play on the slides and swing set until I either got bored or if security came along and told me to go back inside. So there I was, just swinging in the dark, when I heard something near the fence that separated the trees from the playground. It was a strange noise, like someone was sawing wood, but there was something just off about it. I ignored the sound, but it became louder as time passed, to the point where I became curious as to what was causing this strange noise. There were no lights at the playground itself, but there were lights mounted to the back of the apartment buildings that illuminated things just enough to where you could see your surroundings. But the trees beyond the fence were pitch black. I got off the swing set and approached the edge of the playground. The sound continued getting louder, even as I got up right to the fence. It wasn't until I let out a curious, "Hello?" that the noise ceased. I stood there staring into the dark trees, waiting for a response, but all remained silent. After about another minute passed, I innocently asked, "Why are you chopping down trees in the dark?" I then heard a shuffling from within the trees, and soon I saw a dark figure come into view, but did not step out from the tree line. What happened next is something that still makes me want to vomit out my insides. The dark figure then threw something. The object flew over the fence and hit me directly in the chest. I was knocked backwards, more out of surprise than the actual force of the impact. "Hey, why'd you do that?" I shouted, but before I could get another word out, I caught a glimpse of what had been thrown at me. A severed human arm was lying on the ground in front of me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran back towards the apartments, bawling my eyes out. I stormed into our apartment and sat on the living room couch to collect myself. I did think about waking my sick mother and telling her about what happened, but decided against it. To give you some perspective, my mother grew up in Siberia, and she could be quite ruthless at times. Not only would she not be too happy about being woken up, but she most likely wouldn't believe my story. And I probably wouldn't be able to sit down for a week if she found out I left the apartment alone after dark. So I kept this incident to myself. As a child, I understood that what happened was scary, but I had no grasp of the implications. I thought there was a monster in the woods who ate people who came out after dark. Now that I'm an adult, there are some things that I've come to realize. For our remaining time in Belarus, I never saw or heard any kind of investigation regarding a missing person or a mutilated body being discovered, which is nothing out of the ordinary living in Soviet society. The monster in the woods, hiding in the trees that night, was most likely a sadistic madman dismembering a human body with a hacksaw. There is one more thing that I should mention. For the rest of the time that we lived there, I cannot for the life of me recall ever seeing my friend Sasha again after that night.
My friend and I both planned on watching our high school basketball team playing a really big tournament game. He lived literally less than a mile from the arena where the tournament was being held. We both agreed that 5 o'clock was a good time to go walk over there together as we both didn't have a car. And that was a good time to get good seats as the arena would be packed around 6:30. Around 4 o'clock that day, I was at the shopping center that is about 2 blocks away from his house. 4:35 rolled around, and I started to leave the shopping center and walk my way over to Shane's house. On the way there, I had the sudden urge to piss, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold it. It felt like an eternity, but I arrived at his street at 4:45, and I felt like my bladder was about to explode. As I got there, I realized how spaced out the houses are from one another, so finding a private place to urinate seemed impossible. However, I finally found a very large bush in front of a house that was for rent around half a mile down from Shane's house, and I looked around for anyone that would be standing around. Nobody was there. Relieved, I began to use the bathroom. I hear someone from a short distance walking. Embarrassed, I quickly zipped my pants up and looked back. It was an older man, probably around mid-50s to early 60s, about 5'8" and 150 pounds, wearing an outdated style pair of overalls and a red baseball cap. He was staring at me intensely, as if he were mad at me for some reason, while walking in my direction. I began to walk in the direction of Shane's house, which was the direction that the man was coming from, and I was passing him. I realized that he had 2 little boys with him, both around the ages of 10 to 12, along with a dog that was attached to a leash. I didn't think much of them until I heard a door swing open aggressively and someone yelling, "Hey, come back here." I looked back and saw that the man was armed with a rifle. He started running toward me, and I instantly started running faster than I thought humanly possible. He was about 2 car lengths behind me, and I could see Shane's house coming up. I looked back and saw my life flash before my eyes when I saw him starting to point the rifle at me and fire a shot that barely missed my left side. I yanked Shane's door open and slammed it shut, locking it in the process. Shane came running from his room, asking if I was okay and what happened. I told him everything while out of breath from running so much, and he was freaking out. Shane ended up reporting the incident, and when the police came back, they found no one. The man was gone. It turns out the house was up for rent for the past 6 months at the time, and has been vacated since then. I gave them a description of the man again, and that was that. Surprisingly, Shane wanted to go to the basketball game anyway, but I didn't want to go anymore. However, I didn't want to just leave him there by himself, so I reluctantly went. Shane and I ended up needing to get a ride, as we both knew it wasn't safe to go outside and walk over there. It was getting a little late out there, and friends were waiting for us to show up at the arena. While we were there, I had a hard time enjoying the game, as I couldn't shake off the fact that I could have lost my life back there. And if it wasn't for Shane's front door being unlocked, I probably wouldn't be here.
I live in a major city in Texas. My apartment complex is gated and in a good neighborhood, but the security isn't extremely tight. Sometimes the gates are left open and anyone could piggyback off of someone else entering the access code. Maybe twice in the past 3 years, the management has put out notices of vehicle break-ins and other items being stolen from porches. We also have frequent door-to-door solicitors, even though there are signs forbidding it. So this particular Friday evening, I go to bed at about 2:30 a.m. For some odd reason, I was having trouble getting to sleep, so I put on a podcast to listen to and eventually start to doze off. I become aware of a noise that sounds like a clicking sound, but it sounds like one of my upstairs neighbors making some noise. I kinda zone this out, as I'm used to my neighbors staying up late on weekends. After about 30 seconds, I realize the noise is extremely repetitive and getting louder. I then start focusing on it more intently, trying to isolate what it could be and where it was coming from. Suddenly it hits me. It's coming from the entrance to my apartment. I leap out of bed and head to the foyer. I identify the noise right away. The lock mechanism is moving back and forth rapidly, like someone is trying to unlock the front door. I can hear that an object is inserted into the lock and the person is jimmying it back and forth with a lot of force. I instinctively turn around, head to my bedside safe, unlock it with a combination, and pull out my .357 SIG pistol, load a 14-round magazine, and chamber a hollow point round. I head back to the door, and as I exit the bedroom, I see the lock twist and unlatch. I immediately pointed my weapon straight ahead, knowing that if someone comes through, I will have to make a split-second reaction. I decide that if someone comes through my door, I will give them a momentary chance to retreat, but if they do anything other than that, or enter aggressively, I'm going to shoot and ask questions later. They don't enter. However, because I had also locked the deadbolt inside only, when I first moved in a year prior, I remember thinking that the deadbolt was a great security feature, and I got in the habit of always keeping it locked when I'm home. In hindsight, this decision saved me from a life-or-death confrontation. Upon realizing that, I approached the door and looked through the keyhole. On the other side are 3 Asians, 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 are wearing hoodies, so it's difficult to make out their faces. The men have objects in their hands, but I can't make out exactly what. The 2 men are talking back and forth, probably trying to figure out why they can't open the door, even though they have successfully opened the outside lock at this point. The woman is also talking loudly behind the 2 men, such that anyone in the hallway would be able to hear her voice. She's talking in another language. The only words I can make out are, blah blah blah, apartment 250, blah blah blah, and she keeps repeating that over and over like a broken record. Upon hearing that, I start to wonder for a moment if maybe they're just drunk and have the wrong apartment number. But that's impossible. To open my lock, they would have to have a copy of my exact key or some kind of lock-picking device. I've never copied my key or even given it to anyone. And here's the other thing. Not only is 250 not my apartment number, but, as I figured out later, that apartment number doesn't exist anywhere in the complex. Standing back from the door, I take a long broom handle and jab it hard in the face of the door, letting them know that I'm on the other side. They immediately stop fiddling with the lock and take off running. I debate whether to call 911 and decide against it until they return. I know they'll be long gone by the time anyone gets there. It would be too risky to follow them to try and get a better description or license plate, and I don't have enough identifying info as it is to make an arrest. I filed a police report the next day and let the apartment management know. They said it was unusual, but they would alert the resource officer and ask for a police presence for a couple of nights. Nothing ever came of the report, but that's not a surprise to me. It's been 7 months since this happened and no further incidents. Nobody else in the apartment has reported anything similar happening. I don't think they'll be back, but one precaution I took was to buy a smart lock for the deadbolt, so I can leave that deadbolt always locked from the inside, even when I'm not home. It's crazy to think that the deadbolt was the only thing between myself and an armed confrontation with intruders. They say you don't really know what you'll do in those situations until it really happens, but I can honestly say I am proud of how I stayed calm and was mentally prepared to defend myself. If there's one good thing that came out of this, I feel confident that I responded the right way and was ready for the unthinkable. It was probably only after my close call that my mind really started to run away with what could have happened were it not for my dog. I'm a 26-year-old female. I live with my fiancé, my 2 cats, and my dog Rowan. Our house is literally less than a minute away from a huge farmer's field that is frequented by many dog walkers at all times of the day. Me and my significant other often take turns walking Rowan around the field throughout the day. It was only around 7:30 p.m., and it was still really bright and sunny. Rowan was letting me know it was time to go for a walk, so while my partner was tinkering in the garage, I grabbed his lead and headed to the field. Let me quickly tell you about Rowan. He's a 2-year-old Rottweiler who is very loving and playful, if a little daft, but would not hurt a fly, not a bad bone in his body. He's also extremely well trained. We made sure to put the effort in, as he's a big dog breed with a bad rep, so wanted to make a point of not feeding stereotypes. I'm very much of the opinion of there's no bad dogs, just bad owners. Unfortunately, we've had some run-ins with some not-so-good owners, so Rowan gets a little nervous when meeting new dogs and people, but we're working on it. Now back to the story. We're walking around the farmer's field. Rowan is off sniffing and peeing on every blade of grass in sight. I always keep an eye out for other walkers anyway, due to Rowan being a little nervous, and I clocked a guy on his own, walking down the path towards me fairly far away. At first I thought nothing of it, as plenty of people walk this route without dogs. We were just coming out of lockdown in the UK. As the guy got closer, I noticed he was in a full tracksuit with the hood up, which was odd, as it was like 23 degrees, so shorts and a t-shirt weather. He then took a small path off the field leading through some bushes. It was a public-made shortcut rather than an official public footpath, but it was well enough used, so I kept walking, thinking nothing of it. At about 15 meters away from the path he took, Rowan shot back to my side, immediately dropping the mouthful of dirt he had been pretending not to eat. He's not the smartest. I pet him, and noticed he was standing super alert, staring at the path entrance. When I looked up, I caught a glimpse of the man peeking around the edge of the bushes that concealed the entrance. I stopped dead in my tracks, and Rowan's fur stood on end as he positioned himself in front of me. It took me a second to realize that this man had been watching and waiting in the bushes for me to approach. My current route would have meant that I'd be walking right by the path opening. My stomach dropped as I realized we were the only ones around on that field. I had this weird moment where I was almost trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, but then the guy whistled. Not a wolf whistle, but as if to try and get my dog to come to him. Rowan was having none of that, though, and I definitely took that as my cue to trust my stranger danger instincts. I immediately turned and sped walked back the way we came, simultaneously pulling my phone out and dialing my partner's number. I ended up having to clip on Rowan's lead on to get him to walk with me, and he was not taking his eyes away from the path. He was even growling a little, which was so out of character and put me on edge even more. I glanced back, and the man had edged slightly out of the bushes, watching me walk away. My partner answered the phone after a few rings. I was only halfway through stammering out the story, and he was already sprinting up the field to meet me, telling me to stay on the phone, but to keep an eye on the man. The man in the tracksuit now fully came out of the bushes and just stood staring at me, walking away. I dared a quick look away from him towards the entrance to the field to see my fiancé jogging towards me. He was relieved I was okay, but was also immediately pointing and shouting, "Is that him?" Clearly furious at what this man might have had in his mind had Rowan not picked up on him hiding in the bushes. I eventually convinced my fiancé not to confront him, as he was still stood staring, almost taunting us. You never know what people might be capable of, or have concealed. We came off of the field and took Rowan on a different walk, which he was more than happy about. I've never been so proud of him for stepping up and protecting me. Safe to say, he got plenty of treats and fussing when we got home. Back in 2005, I was 15 years old, and like any teenage girl, my main source of income was babysitting. I mainly babysat for 2 families, Family A, which was every Monday and Wednesday for 4 hours in the afternoon, and Family B, which was different evenings when the parents had events they wanted to go to. The moms of the two families were first cousins, and the mom of Family B used to babysit myself and my sisters when we were little. All of us, myself, Family A, and Family B, lived within a 5-mile radius of each other in the Michigan countryside. On the night my story takes place, I was babysitting for Family B. It was a Friday night in the middle of summer, and the two children, a boy 4 years old and a girl 2, went to bed fairly easily. I know it was after 10 p.m. because it was dark out when the little boy came downstairs and said he couldn't sleep, so he wanted to sit on the couch with me. I was watching the movie The Patriot on TV and let him snuggle up with me, and he went right back to sleep. Shortly after he came down, the phone rang. I looked at the caller ID to see if it was the family calling when I saw it was my home calling. I answered the phone, and it was my dad. He said something that basically boiled down to this. "Hey, so there's an escaped convict in the area. Police are out looking for him, so if you hear police sirens or a helicopter, don't be alarmed." And then he hung up. I, quite frankly, was terrified. I was a 15-year-old girl alone in an old farmhouse. The nearest neighbor was about a quarter of a mile away, and I had 2 babies in the house that I had to protect. My dad had sounded so cavalier, like he was warning me that it was going to rain. I had no idea what this man had done to be chased by the police, but it had to be bad. I went looking around the house for something to defend us with. All I had were kitchen knives, no baseball bat, no crowbar, and no access to the gun in the safe. I ended up calling my dad and asking him to come stay with me. He actually thought I was being ridiculous, but I didn't care. I felt better. Thankfully, nothing happened. When the parents got home an hour later, my dad explained why he was there. The mom was very understanding and showed me how to get into the gun safe and where the bullets were. Like I said, she was our babysitter growing up, and she was basically my older sister. She was, and still is, a big believer in the Second Amendment and self-defense. But my story didn't end there. That next Monday, I was babysitting for Family A, which had 2 girls, 4 years and 2 years old. The older girl was telling me a story about someone in the backyard and how they couldn't go back in their house and had to stay outside all night. When the mom got home, I asked her about it. It turns out that the previous Friday, the police had been at their house until the wee hours of the morning. Family A's neighbor had a restraining order against her ex-boyfriend for domestic violence, and he had shown up at her house late on Friday. She called the cops, and he had fled into the property of Family A because he had several arrest warrants out. The police kept Family A out of their house for safety reasons while they searched the area. They eventually found the guy and took him to jail. That's what all the fuss was about that Friday when I was babysitting for Family B. Fortunately, he never got close to Family B's house. That incident was the start of me being more proactive in safety, making sure I knew how to lock the doors, where any weapons were, and to make sure I had a knife with me at all times. If something like that ever happens again, I know I will handle the situation much better.
My name is Nicole, and I'm 16 years old. During my freshman year, I would walk to and from school. I didn't take the bus because I got bullied a lot, so I walked to help clear my mind and just relax. I took the same path every day, which was passing by some old buildings, a daycare, and an empty parking lot. I did that a lot for about 5 months. I was leaving my apartment and walking towards the back of the buildings, as it was faster, when I ran into this man. He looked to be in his late 20s, had a white shirt on, and was bald. He said hi and be careful. It was pretty random, but I blew him off. I kept walking for about 5 minutes, and I got to the old buildings, and a white truck pulled up next to me. I turned and I saw it was the same man. He asked me if I needed a ride, and I said no. He said, "Are you sure? I know you go to that school down the road, and in the 10th grade. It won't be a bother." And my heart sank. I'd never seen this man in my life, and he knew what school I went to and what grade I was in. I declined again, and he drove off. I didn't tell my mom about the incident. I just kept walking to and from school. A week passed, and I saw him again by the old buildings. It was foggy and raining outside, and he pulled up next to me in the same white truck. He rolled down the window and asked, "Do you need a ride, sweetheart?" You're going to get all wet. And I said no thanks, and continued to walk faster. He started to follow me and kept saying things like, come on, it's cold, and I know you don't want to walk out there. It's just a 2-minute drive, you'll be fine. I turned and told him to leave me alone, and that I had to get to school. I guess me raising my voice and saying what I had to say made him mad. He put the vehicle in park and opened the door. My heart sank and I froze. I couldn't run. I couldn't speak. I was in shock. He started walking toward me, and then an old man walked out of nowhere and said, "Hey Cassie, I didn't see you all day yesterday. You didn't show up for work and I was worried. Can you help me with something really quick?" It was the man from the store. I understood what he was doing. I turned and the man with the white truck ran back to his truck and took off. I started crying as the old man told me he had saw what happened and had to spring into action. I thanked him and called my friend to drop me off at school. Later on that day, I had forgotten about the incident until my teacher pulled me out of class. He told me that when he was driving into work, he saw what had happened and how the man had been following me. He took me to the front office and had to make a report and called my mom to inform her what happened. The police said they would look into it, but they never found the man. I would have given them the plate number, but at the moment, when it all happened, I haven't thought of that. I'm a sophomore now, but I don't walk to school anymore after that. In fact, I don't really go outside of my apartment at all. I often think about what would have happened if that old man never came out the store and what the guy in the truck would have done to me.
During my time in college, I had a friend whose dad owned an 800-acre piece of land in eastern Texas. In the past, he leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but was no longer doing it. He had built a cabin on the land a few years before and would let us go out there from time to time to mess around. It served as a great way to relax from the pressures of school and getting closer to nature. The spring break of 1997, we loaded up our trucks and headed for the cabin. Our plans included shooting guns, drinking beer, and other things rednecks like us do in the woods. Our first morning kept us pretty busy cleaning the cabin and moving all our stuff inside. Around dinner, we made a big fire outside and cooked a bunch of steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and broke open some beers. The sun went down not long after, and for the remainder of the evening we got loaded and passed around a joint or two. At some point in the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went out to check on it. The fire was barely burning at that point, and just outside of its light, I swore I could see the shape of a man standing completely still. From what I could tell, he was facing me, perhaps waiting to see what I would do. I blinked my eyes real hard to get a clearer look, but my position and the lack of light made it hard to see clearly. The shape continued to stand still, so I decided I'd walk up a little closer in hopes of getting a better picture. The thought terrified me, but I was transfixed by the being. Or perhaps I was still too intoxicated to make wise decisions. I took 2 steps forward, but was distracted by a voice behind me. My friend had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. So he got out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice caused me to jump a little, but I soon realized who it was speaking. I asked him if he saw the figure on the other side of the fire pit. He just laughed at me and said I must be so stoned I was seeing things. We laughed it off and returned to bed. On my way, I turned back to take one more look, but the shape was no longer there. I chuckled to myself and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wrote the whole experience off as the result of too much fun and went on with my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the big pond. Post-lunch was shooting guns and one guy's compound bow that he had just bought. The beers and smoke were broken out after dinner. A game of poker was attempted but soon canceled in favor of another evening telling lies around the fire. On one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, I was spooked by the sound of a stick breaking close by and noped it back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made the other guys laugh their butts off. I tried to explain what had happened, but was quickly reminded that we weren't the only creatures in the woods. The reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were standing around, involved in some deep discussion, and I turned to speak to the guy on my left. What I saw caused me to clench up so tight I could have snapped a steel rod with my sphincter. Standing within a few steps behind my friend was another man I did not recognize. It was like he appeared out of nowhere. What made it creepier was that he was staring intently at the back of his head, almost like he was trying to bore through it with his eyes. I remained frozen stiff. The longer I looked at him, I realized he was the same being I saw lingering outside the light of the fire the night before. He was average height with a long, unkempt beard. My friend continued rambling about whatever, unaware of his shadow. After several long seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank expression and walked away. This was when my friend finally noticed my horrified look. When he spoke, the thrall of fear was released, and I began pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and my other friend laughed at me again. There was no way I was seeing things this time. I described the man, and one of them suggested he was a Bigfoot. Despite my protestations, no one was buying it, and I eventually cut my losses and shut up. However, I wasn't beat. Their mockery had made me even more determined to prove the stranger's existence. The next 2 days were quiet. No stranger, in other words, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. By our 5th morning, I was beginning to question my sanity. I'd seen this mysterious being stalking around us twice, and now it had suddenly disappeared. I resolved to put my quest on the back burner until some new evidence arose. My friend's dad had mentioned him, an owner of one of the surrounding properties, had spotted a small group of wild hogs running through his land, so we grabbed our rifles and went on the search for them. A mile or so down one of the property's many roads, we came across some hog wallows and knew we were on the scent. We went up the road, now on foot tracking them. Another mile on, we stumbled upon 3 large hogs rooting up the ground and prepared to make bacon. 2 of us chambered around as quiet as possible on our rifles and took aim. I was less than a second from saying 3 and pulling the trigger when the loud crack of another rifle filled the air, followed closely by a burst of wood and bark above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to register that we were being shot at. A few seconds later, another crack and strike, this time even closer to my friend. We weren't going to wait for a third. The friend who appeared to be the target led us down a side trail that led back to the cabin. No more shots followed as we fled. However, instead of finding safety at the camp, the shots began again. Seeing no other option, we hopped into my truck and hauled it out of there. This was a time just before the commonality of cell phones, so we had to drive the 20 miles to town to get help. After we explained the situation, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the cars when we parked. We waited to see if the shots would start again, but nothing happened. A cursory look around counted 3 holes in the cabin and another 2 in my buddy's windshield. Perhaps the worst was that all of our camping stuff, sleeping bags and such, were spread out all over the ground. Luckily, we'd smoked everything the night before, so the police were none the wiser. Nothing was missing but a box of .30-30 ammo and, strangely, my sleeping bag and wool blanket. A theory began to form in the deputy's mind that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping out on the property for whatever reason. They acted as if they were going to let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he put pressure on them to start a search. This was about the time I repeated my story of seeing someone lurking around the cabin. No one was laughing now, and my story was finally being taken seriously by somebody. The search was led around the property by my friend's dad. School had already begun again by the time it took place. It continued for a full week, but nothing other than a few old camps were found. It was assumed that he knew the heat would be on him after the shooting incident, and he moved on. During the course of the investigation, several avenues were followed to ID the stranger like escaped cons, but he remains unidentified to this day. Because of the chance of another attack, our trips to the property ended. The next year we tried to camp out somewhere else, but it wasn't the same and our nature getaways died out. Within 5 years, my friend's dad had a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease were renewed, and the land's trees have been used to make paper and pulpwood products ever since. Each time I jot down a quick note, I'm reminded of our awesome trips, and especially the odd and terrifying week that caused them to stop. I do, once or twice a year, talk to my old college friends on the phone. As far as he's heard, that crazy stranger still hasn't been caught. We sometimes theorize as to his origins and where he may have ended up. I, however, often take this much further when I'm alone. I wonder why our so-called strangers seem to focus so much of his anger onto my friend, and perhaps, far more concerning, is he still out there waiting for his chance to finish what he began all those years ago?